I like V Rising. Do I think it's a perfect game? No. But it cost me $20 and I've played 60 hours of it. If that's not an easy recommendation, I don't know what is. V Rising is a multiplayer survival crash crafting game in the vein of Valheim or Rust. However, instead of following in their lead and being a first person or some sort of over the shoulder camera, V Rising has a top down camera much closer to something like Diablo or other classic ARPGs. Also, instead of being a human who's been unlucky enough or blessed enough to be granted magical powers or tossed onto a random island, thank you Orioth, you are a vampire. The vampire thing is not just the theme. Sure, there is a blood meter that replaces your hunger bar, but who you drink blood from also heavily impacts gameplay. Drink blood from a worker and you'll harvest more resources. Drink blood from a nun and you'll restore health when casting spells, just like a real-life nun. Drink blood from a warrior and you can parry some incoming attacks. Also, if you stand outside in the daytime, you are going to burn like a motherfucker. The general gameplay loop of V Rising is pretty straightforward. After you get out of the game's equivalent of a tutorial and have a simple base setup, you'll venture out to farm materials to craft better gear. Once your gear is good enough, you'll go fight a boss, or a V-Blood carrier. Defeating a boss and harvesting V-Blood unlocks additional spells, powers, and crafting recipes. Then you can craft even better gear, but that might require expanding your base, which requires you to go out and harvest resources. So you rinse and repeat. Of course, when I say harvest resources, I mean less in a harvest crops from farming Minecraft sort of way and more in a humans in the Matrix sort of way, except you're the robots. V Rising's combat is probably closest to battle rate, not surprising that Stunlock gave both games. If you're not familiar with battle rate, I'd say it feels like a slower paced version of League of Legends. Also, damage, health, and level is completely dependent upon the level of the gear you have equipped. If I have any complaints, one might be that I never really had that power fantasy moment that I get from games like Path of Exile. Instead, you're limited to only 3 skills, from your weapon, 2 spells, and an ultimate skill. Even when you outlevel an enemy, unless the difference is absolutely massive, you can still just kind of get put into the dirt. The combat is at its best when you're fighting against the game's boss fights, the V-Blood carriers. But it's kind of at its most annoying most of the time when you're fighting against packs or random mobs. There's also multiplayer. I don't have too much to say on the multiplayer, mostly because I feel like it's a very expansive experience, and trying to summarize it would just be incorrect. My first few hours, and by few I mean 50, were with a few friends on a publicly hosted PvE server. The next 10 were with those same group of friends on a privately hosted PvP server, and now we're not friends anymore. Jokes aside, the multiplayer does work well, and many of the factors like resource scaling, for example how much stuff you get out of beating somebody up, are configurable. If you want a comfy base building setup with some friends, you can join or host a PvE server with 5x resources and the ability to teleport. And if you're some sort of masochist, you can host a 0.5% resource PvP server, presumably because you're insane. Changing the pace and flow is pretty much just a server config setting. Like I mentioned before, I don't think the game's perfect. There's a whole system for binding and turning humans into vampire servants, but their utility is basically limited to equipping them with a bit of gear and sending them out on timed missions, a la things like Farmville from 2008. In addition, while the weapons themselves are fairly diverse, the gear that you have as body armor and stuff like that is pretty much a completely linear path, with no build diversity other than big number good. Still, though, there's a lot more thought put into V Rising than I feel like there's often put into games of this genre. For example, it's not possible to build a base in such a way that it blocks off other players from critical resources. In addition, the number of bosses is fairly high, and despite some of them being quote-unquote random humans, the actual fights all feel meaningful and different. I think V Rising's greatest strength compared to a lot of the other sort of crafting survival games that I've played is how solid the game loop feels. Get resources, go kill a V-Blood, get an upgrade, go for the next V-Blood. In 60 hours, I only had to look at a wiki once or 2 times, and I never encountered any real janky moments. V Rising is $20 on Steam. It's a pretty good time. And in case you're wondering, oh, is he only saying that because he's a sponsored shill? I actually bought this game before I applied for the code and got the second copy of it. If you're looking for a really solid survival game or a base builder, I feel very comfortable recommending it.